Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Historical Happy Hour. My name is Kevin Impellizeri. My pronouns are he and him, and as Rachel said, I'm the Assistant Director for the Center for Education here at the College of Physicians of Philadelphia. And so I'm so excited to be your host tonight to explore a bit about the history of the pseudoscience of physiognomy and its relationship to Bram Stoker's iconic tale of Gothic horror, Dracula. This event is part of our series of events that we're calling the Year of Dracula, which is our year-long commemoration of the 125th anniversary of Dracula's publication. So what are my qualifications for talking about this? Now, in addition to my help with the initiatives at the college, I have a PhD in history and had a background in undergraduate in literature. And on cards on the table, my research background is actually in the history of video games. And some of you may have been on my previous talk back in February, where I talked about the relationship between video games and health during the early 1980s. But in addition to my specific research that I got studying my dissertation in, I'm also really interested in the intersections of popular culture and media with society. And Dracula's a really fascinating way of talking about that, just the amount of impact it's had on popular culture. Also, as part of that, I figured to represent video games here a little bit. I decided to wear my shirt, which is the crest of the House of Belmont, the famous vampire fighting family from the Castlevania video game series. So you can guess I'm kind of a massive pop culture nerd when it comes to these things, and I'm super excited to talk about this topic today. Before we do that, let's start with a drink. Our drink tonight, I decided, tied into the blood, and so I made sangria and sent a recipe out to the group. Sangria is a fairly easy, simple, and inexpensive drink to make. Pretty much all you need is a cheap 750 milliliter bottle of wine. I mixed mine this time with 3/4 of a cup of orange juice. You can also put some pomegranate juice in it. It's also quite good for that. I cut up and muddled some apples and half an orange, along with about 2/3 of a tablespoon of brown sugar, and left it to chill overnight. So this is nice and cold. So it's got a beautiful rouge color to it. So why don't we open with a toast to Dracula? So hold on camera. There we are. All right. Again, looks really good. As Renfield would say, the blood is the life. Mine turned out great. I hope all yours turned out great too. All right, with that out of the way, let's turn our attention to Dracula. As the novel begins, Jonathan Harker, a young English solicitor, travels to the Transylvanian region of Romania to the secluded castle of Count Dracula, who has employed him to help oversee some real estate deals he's closing in London. Dracula greets Harker, invites him to his home, and offers him a meal. And following supper, they settle by the fireplace, where Harker takes the time to quietly observe the features of his host, whom he describes as possessing a marked physiognomy. Quote, his face was a very strong, aquiline, with high bridge of thin nose and peculiarly arched nostrils, with lofty domed forehead and hair growing scantily round the temples but profusely elsewhere. His eyebrows were very massive, almost meeting over the nose, and with bushy hair that seemed to curl in its own profusion. The mouth, so far as I could see it under the heavy mustache, was fixed and rather cruel-looking, with peculiarly sharp white teeth. These protruded over the lips, whose remarkable ruddiness showed astonishing vitality in a man of his years. For the rest, his ears were pale, and at the tops extremely pointed. The chin was broad and strong, and the cheeks firm though thin. The general effect was one of extraordinary pallor. End quote. In examining Dracula's features, Harker takes a detailed mental inventory of not just the Count's appearance, but his moral character. A chin that conveyed strength, a mouth that conveyed cruelty, and bushy eyebrows and an eagle-like nose that evoked strong perception and mental faculties. Alas, we can't say too much about the Count's temperament because Harker neglected to relay the state of the wrinkles on his forehead. Are they furrowed, meaning the Count has stormy passions? Are they irregular, a clear sign of ill temper? Do they meet at the place his nose and forehead connect, suggesting cruelty? Or does the Count's forehead lack wrinkles at all, demonstrating peace of mind? Harker, alas, leaves it to the reader to speculate. In any case, Harker is trying to be scientific about his assessment of the Count and drawing what he feels are objective conclusions about his host's character by studying his face. This was a practice known as physiognomy, a common scientific practice at the time Bram Stoker wrote Dracula, and he himself was a believer in the science. Moreover, it was a practice that made its way into both Victorian intellectual thought as well as literature in Stoker's time. And you might be surprised that while this so-called science of face reading has long since been disproven, physiognomy in many respects still resonates into the present day. So today, we're going to examine the history of physiognomy, from its origins in ancient Greek philosophy to its most influential advocate, a Swiss theologian named Johann Caspar Lavater. We'll examine the thought process behind it, including some of what physiognomists felt were sure signs of a person's character, which we'll use to try to make some physiognomic conclusions of our own. Next, we'll briefly examine physiognomy's impact on scientific thought during the 19th century, especially on medicine. This is where we get to bring in some fun and interesting elements of the Mütter Museum's collection. And then we'll look at how it cropped up both in Dracula as well as other contemporary English fiction. And finally, we'll address its legacy and the way physiognomy has influenced both popular culture and modern science. Let's start with the history. Arguably, the earliest detailed examination of physiognomy is an ancient Greek text titled Physiognomics, also known by a slightly spookier Latin name as the Physiognomica. Now, some writers and scholars during Bram Stoker's time attributed this work to Aristotle, although it probably wasn't written by Aristotle himself. What's more likely is that it was written by someone influenced by Aristotelian thought, which is a type of intellectual analysis that's reliant on stating one or several fundamental truths, which, if are accepted as true, provide the foundation for a line of reasoning, sort of on the model of, we all know X is true. And if X is true, then Y and Z are also true. Now, one thing we're not really going to talk about today, but is worth mentioning, is that one of the severe limitations of this kind of Aristotelian line of reasoning is what happens when the fundamental truth is just totally wrong. For example, taking some other Aristotelian ideas, what happens when we assume that the Earth is the center of the universe, or that the body's health is determined by their level of blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile? In the case of physiognomics, the science of physiognomy is built upon two fundamental truths. First, there is a direct one-to-one relationship between a person's character and their physical appearance. Or as the writer explained, quote, mental character is not independent of and unaffected by bodily processes, but is conditioned by the state of the body. And contrariwise, the body is sympathetically influenced by the affections of the soul, end quote. In short, how you look is a literal reflection of who you are. The other fundamental truth presented in physiognomists, and follow me on this one, is that every species of animal exemplifies one or set of specific characteristics. Now, based on those ideas, here's the underlying thought process at the heart of physiognomy. And we'll elaborate that one in a minute. If we assume that all animals have specific characteristics inherent to their species, and physical characteristics reflect moral character, therefore, there must be some physical characteristic a specific animal exhibits that demonstrates that specific characteristic. And carrying this over to humans, this means that if a person has physical traits that resemble a specific animal, then it stands to reason that they possess the same moral trait as that animal. Ironclad logic, I see no flaws, no notes. As an 1817 work on physiognomy explained, quote, we may judge of the manners and tempers of all animals by their looks. For instance, it is natural for the lion to be strong and easily provoked, which can be perceived by his form and looks. The leopard is pretty and delicate, but is nevertheless subject to anger, to lying in ambush, to treachery, and is at once timid and bold, which exactly corresponds with his external appearance. And so it is with other animals. The bear is cruel, deceitful, unsocial, and savage. The wild boar has a fearless fury for which he gives himself up. The ox is severe and simple. The horse is proud and desirous of glory. The fox is cunning and lies in wait. The monkey is jocose and dissembling. The sheep is plain and dull. The goat is lazy. The hog is filthy and gluttonous. The same thing holds good with respect to birds and reptiles. If then it happens that a man possesses a member or feature which resembles that of an animal or bird, it is by that resemblance he must be judged. For if his eyes are of a tawny color, and a little concave, you must remember that they are similar to that of the lion. If very much concave, they denote bad manners and agree with those of the monkey. If level, they resemble those of the bull. If they seem to start from his head and are very prominent, stupid, and disagreeable to the sight, they have some likeness to those of the ass. I don't know if we know people in our lives who might look like an ass. But having established this, advocates of physiognomy catalog physical signifiers of different personality traits, which they argued a trained observer could measure. Here's a few examples from that same 1817 trait. And I dare you to maybe try to check these on yourselves. I know I was doing when I was researching this. For example, different eye colors meant different personality types. Blue is an indication of a calm disposition, while also a sign of feebleness and effeminacy. Black showed energy. Gray demonstrated an irritable or bad-tempered personality. Hazel and brown eyes showed vivacity and affability. A person's cunning was proportional to how close their eyes were to their nose. And speaking of the nose, a beak-shaped nose showed, quote, imperious temper and ardent passions, end quote. A large ridge, quote, denotes a mind endowed with qualities of a high order, end quote. A curved nose was the sign of a natural leader. Small nostrils meant you were timid. As for the mouth, a lot depended on the size and shape of the lips and a person's natural expression when their face is at rest. Thick lips were a sign of both sensuality and laziness. A tightly shut mouth meant you were greedy. An underbite, where the lower lip stuck out more than the upper, demonstrated something called negative goodness. Meanwhile, full, distinct, and well-proportioned lips indicated an honorable person. As for chins, because I know you were curious, a prominent chin meant you were energetic, while a weak chin indicated moral weakness. A pointed chin meant craftiness. A double chin meant you were sensual. A small chin meant you were timid. And a dimpled chin meant you were good-natured. As for your neck, a long neck indicated gentleness. A thick, veiny neck meant you were passionate. This level of examination also extended beyond facial features to include posture, manner of speech, and even how often someone blinked. Rapid blinking, if you're curious, meant you were either cowardly or bad-tempered. Now, physiognomy as an idea bounced around European thought over the next several centuries. However, it gained mainstream popularity during the late 18th and into the 19th centuries, thanks to a Swiss theologian named Johann Caspar Lavater. Between the 1780s and 1790s, Lavater published a series of 5 essays mapping out the science of physiognomy, known as Essays on Physiognomy. These treatises were widely circulated in Europe and the United States throughout the 19th century, receiving dozens of reprintings in multiple languages. To get a sense of their longevity, the Historical Medical Library of the College of Physicians of Philadelphia has a copy of Essays on Physiognomy in the collection from the 1880s, and this particular copy is listed as the 17th edition, to again give you a sense of how often this thing has been passed around. Now, Lavater had a lot of similar ideas on the connection between physical characteristics and moral character as his ancient Greek predecessor. In addition to what we've already covered, Lavater also argued that a person's actions over time left an indelible mark on the face. Think of each section of the face like a muscle that is connected to a specific character trait, and every time you exhibited that trait, you were working out that muscle. It would stand to reason, then, that a trained physiognomist could measure a person's behavior in addition to their base characteristics. Every lie they told, every cruel word they uttered, anytime they cheated or stole, would bear its mark upon the subject's physical appearance. Now, before we get into some examples of this and try to put on our physiognomy hats of ourselves, I think it's worth critically examining Lavater's claims, as well as those of physiognomy as a whole. I think we can all see one of the fundamental flaws of this line of reasoning, and that a lot of it hinges on the innate qualities of animals, which I feel is much more arbitrary and culturally determined than physiognomists let on. For example, Lavater thought that owls were connected with stupidity, reasoning that if a person had a larger than average head like an owl, it meant they were not very intelligent compared to the way we think of owls today. On top of that, I think you can pick up on this, and is that many of its claims, if not all of them, are virtually impossible to measure. However, that being said, I would absolutely love to read a peer-reviewed essay measuring courage levels in lions relative to the size of their noses. Another issue with physiognomy is that, like its related pseudoscience phrenology, which is a similar scientific practice applied to the contours of the skull, and which came to prominence around the same time as physiognomy, is that a lot of the foundations of physiognomy rest upon the biases of the observer. Lavater and other physiognomists typically started with a conclusion about a person and then worked backwards, identifying physical characteristics that confirmed their conclusions. For example, in the first volume of Essays on Physiognomy, Lavater presents sketches of a bunch of famous people and then points out different traits that confirm what they're famous for. He shows a picture of Shakespeare and indicates what parts of the face made him a great playwright. These are all from Essays in Physiognomy, by the way. He does the same for Attila the Hun to show how he was cruel and bloodthirsty. He shows several drawings of Socrates to measure his capacity for complex thought. However, my favorite has to be his analysis of Judas Iscariot, the apostle who betrayed Jesus in the New Testament. And I'm no biblical scholar, again, video game scholar here, but I'm pretty sure there are no records of what Judas looked like. But that didn't stop Lavater from basically drawing a picture of a guy he thought looked untrustworthy and writing a bunch on how you can tell why you should never have trusted this guy. This image on the right is what he thought of Judas Iscariot. Now, with that in mind, why don't we take a look at some of Lavater's sketches and see if what we can learn about these people just by looking at their faces. So here's our first one. I'm going to bring up the chat so I can see it. Take a few minutes to look at this. And people share in the chat, what do you think that Lavater wanted us to think about this person? I'll give it like maybe half a minute. So this is Judas looks like Captain Hook. Smart and trustworthy. Refined. An intelligent know-it-all, a strong leader. Some say he looks strong, ambitious like Napoleon. Studious. So loyal with that straight chin. Have some of you studied physiognomy? Because you're actually pretty close. Here's what Lavater said about this face. Here are the images of extraordinary genius, the features of this face, the outlines of which are neither too angular nor too rigid, decisively evince great energy. The nose alone is indicative of an exalted mind. The position of the eyebrows and the gentle projection and jutting of the chin are characteristic of resolution, and the perfectly happy formation of the forehead displays genius and designates a character in which reflection and activity are at once combined. He whose features unite so many marks of greatness can be no other than a hero. So really positive indication. This is an example of one of them. Using those physiognomic skills that many of you possess, let's look at one more. Again, I'll take a look at the chat. Someone suggested this dude is a young Lavater. It's actually funny you mentioned that. Lavater did a sketch of his own face. He's very self-effacing, if you pardon the pun. Closest people said this guy looks sketchy, untrustworthy. Judas's twin brother. Someone compared him to Mycroft Holmes, that he's cowardly, devious, dim-witted, slow, mean. A lot of people saying this guy is sketch. Again, the Birkin hair vibe. I love the Mütter audience for those. So yeah, you're pretty close. Here's what Lavater wrote about this particular face. This face presents a most hateful character. Craft, sordid avarice, and hardened villainy have disfigured it and distorted the eyes and mouth. None of its muscles or features is expressive of benevolence or sensibility. The scoundrel might always be recognized in these lineaments, however sedulously he may endeavor to hide his soul behind the mask of hypocrisy. However he may attempt to soften his lips into a smile, still his countenance will infallibly belie him. So I wanted you to watch out for this character here. So yeah, this was a little bit about, I kind of gave it goes anyway. So we've all had a laugh at Lavater's expenses, and with this image, I'm kind of doing that too. And in all fairness, you can accuse me of making fun of Lavater and his silly ideas about face measuring for the benefit of over 2 centuries of hindsight. However, I want you all to take comfort in the fact that people in Lavater's time also thought these ideas were silly. And the reason I know that is that Lavater devotes entire chapters in the first volume of Essays in Physiognomy to refuting his critics and complaining that people are making fun of him, including one chapter simply titled, quote, "Reasons Why the Science of Physiognomy is So Often Ridiculed and Treated with Contempt," end quote. He demands to be taken seriously. He complains at one point that people are unfairly comparing it to divination and palm reading, writing, quote, "This sublime science has been debased with the most puerile of follies. It has been confounded with divination by the countenance and the quackery of chiromancy. Nothing more trivial can be imagined, more insulting to common sense, from the time of Aristotle to the present," end quote. He also argues numerous times that the overwhelming majority of people actually agree with him, and his beat old critics are just out there to slander him, which makes me think that Lavater would have been amazing to follow on Twitter. Nevertheless, Despite some people just being just straight up mean to poor old Johann, his ideas did take hold in numerous intellectual circles throughout the 19th century, and people sought to apply the science of face reading to a variety of fields. Notable for us at the Mütter Museum, one of those was medicine. In fact, our historical medical library has several books in the collection devoted to physiognomy and medicine, and I'll briefly highlight two of them. Both of them argued for physiognomy's usefulness as a diagnostic tool. In 1838, a former head of the Royal College of Surgeons named Sir Alexander Morrison published a work titled The Physiognomy of Mental Diseases, where he argued that physiognomy could help diagnose a variety of mental health issues, including depression, substance use, and violent behavior. Morton saw physiognomy as both an early warning sign that a person was inclined toward mental illness, or a measure that someone had been cured of their malady, often thanks to the aid of several favorite mental health treatments at the time, such as enemas, blistering leeches, and the like, or this example from his book of a woman who had depression, who he had her head shaved and mild laxatives and a bath of cold water to try to help that. That's the way to do that. Several years later, in 1849, another British physician named George Corfe put out the Physiognomy of Diseases, which offered a roadmap for physicians to diagnose a variety of ailments just by looking at the features, color, and complexion of a patient's face. Take, for example, his recommendations for diagnosing laryngitis. Quote, the countenance and the condition of the respiration through the larynx will be sufficient guides to the detection of laryngitis when it is once established. There's a sneering dilation of the nostrils and a retraction of the angles of the mouth, distress, anxiety, and suffering, an occasional fighting for breath, a pale, livid lip, a glossy cornea, and a fixed eyeball with some faint touches of lividity over the cheeks usually portray the features of the disease in its acute form, end quote. It's also worth mentioning that Corfe discouraged physicians from asking their patients how they were feeling, arguing that the features and complexion of the face could tell you infinitely more than the words of any patient. Quote, it is a matter of great importance, which is, alas, sadly neglected in the present day, that when a sufferer of some serious disease presents himself to our notice, he should not be allowed to influence the mind of the medical man by the frequent repetition or trifling of subordinate symptoms. And truly, if an experienced man is able to derive much information from medical physiognomy, the minor points upon which the patient may lay stress will not have any corresponding weight in his mind, end quote. Now listen, can you stop going on about how your chest hurts and how it hurts when you breathe? It's really throwing me off from measuring the dilation of your nostrils. Now, on a darker note, as with phrenology, many of the advocates of physiognomy also came in with clear racial biases and used physiognomy as a means of scientifically justifying saying that different racial and ethnic groups were superior or inferior to each other. For example, supporters of both physiognomy and phrenology frequently examined incarcerated people, and that was in no small part because they were an easily accessible body of subjects whom societies deemed to have no rights. To claim that there were parts of the face and the skull that showed people were predisposed to commit certain crimes. There's this whole interest in the Victorian period about identifying the criminal class and kind of like minority report style prejudging people. This person's more likely to commit murder. This person's more likely to do theft and things like that. And physiognomy and phrenology were also common justifiers for slavery because each claimed that there was physical evidence that, for example, Africans needed to be enslaved because of their features belied traits that made them ideal candidates for enslavement. And these kinds of scientific justifications for racism and oppression, especially of marginalized people, have a long, enduring, and dark legacy in science. And physiognomy was part of that system of justifying those kinds of things. Now, with all this talk of cruel mouths, dilated nostrils, and indeterminate forehead wrinkles, you might ask yourself, what does any of this have to do with Dracula? As it turns out, Bram Stoker was really into physiognomy. He once described himself as, quote, a believer in the science, end quote. In fact, he even owned the 5-volume quarto edition of Essays on Physiognomy up until his death in 1912. Physiognomy is mentioned by name twice in the book, both in reference to Jonathan Harker. The first is the passage from chapter 2 in which I opened this discussion, where Harker examines the Count's marked physiognomy. It's also name-dropped in chapter 12 when he talks with Dr. Van Helsing. Harker laments that the state of affairs has left him doubting his very senses, a feeling he thinks that Van Helsing can't relate to, explaining, quote, "Doctor, you don't know what it is to doubt everything, even yourself. No, you don't. You couldn't with eyebrows like yours," end quote. To which Van Helsing exclaims, "So you're a physiognomist." In case you're curious what Harker meant, according to the Pocket Lavater, a condensed version of essays on physiognomy from 1817, which I've referenced a couple times already, eyebrows were connected to cognition and good judgment, with the author observing, quote, "The nearer the eyebrows approach the eyes, the stronger is the assurance they give of solidity and reflection. Angular, discontinuous eyebrows mark an inventive genius. When uneven and disordered, they are proofs of great vivacity, and full, compact, well-disposed, and symmetrical eyebrows are almost always indicative of solidity of judgment and of clear, sound sense," end quote. Even when it isn't mentioned by name, physiognomy is a recurring theme in the novel. Dracula's strong face and cruel mouth reflect his evil intent. However, Dracula and his minions are also a physiognomist nightmare, capable of hiding their true evil selves through more attractive physical shapes. When Dracula comes to London and feeds on young English women, he takes on a more youthful appearance, concealing his evil nature as he stalks the city streets. And maybe Stoker was trying to say something about the folks of London, that a monster like Dracula was able to blend so easily on the London streets, but that's not my area of expertise. When our heroes go to Lucy Westerner's grave to put the vampirized young woman to rest, they're initially reluctant, until they see how the Count's influence has altered the features of her face, especially her eyes, which physiognomists genuinely believe were windows into the soul. As Dr. Seward observes in chapter 16, she had, quote, "Lucy's eyes in form and color, but Lucy's eyes unclean and full of hellfire instead of the pure, gentle orbs we knew. At that moment, the remnant of my love passed into hate and loathing. Had she then to be killed, I could have done it with savage delight," end quote. In chapter 27, when Van Helsing enters the tomb where the brides of Dracula lay in their coffins, he at first hesitates to kill them when he sees them as beautiful sleeping women, observing of one of them, quote, "She lay in her vampire sleep, so full of life and voluptuous beauty that I shudder as though I have come to do murder," end quote. In these respects, part of what makes Dracula a terrifying adversary for the likes of Harker, Van Helsing, and the rest is the Count is capable of hiding his true nature, which, according to Lavater and his supporters, should be otherwise obvious to the trained observer. Beyond Dracula, physiognomy and its subversion were recurring narrative tropes in other works of Victorian literature. For example, Robert Louis Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, published 11 years before Stoker's Dracula, involved the scientist who manages to create two personas embodying both his good and evil selves. Recalling his first transformation into Hyde, Jekyll notes the contrast reflected on the appearance of both identities, writing, quote, "Even as good shone upon the countenance of the one, evil was written broadly and plainly on the face of the other. Evil besides, which I must still believe to be the lethal side of man, had left on that body an imprint of deformity and decay," end quote. Hyde looks the part of evil and cruelty reflected in physiognomy, with other characters describing him as wicked looking. Meanwhile, another predecessor to Stoker's Dracula to focus on physiognomy was Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray, which first appeared in serialized form in 1890, followed by the full novel in 1891. In The Picture of Dorian Gray, a young socialite offers his soul so that a portrait of himself ages instead of him. And over the years, not only does the painting age, its appearance changes to reflect Gray's sins and misdeeds, another subversion of Lavater's idea that a person's actions leave an impression on the face, as no matter what he does, Gray maintains that appearances suggest he's an upstanding person. Because again, they believe if you look good, you must be good on the inside. Physiognomy as a science began to fall out of favor by the mid to late 19th century, even as Stoker and his other authors integrated its ideas into their works. Changes in experimental and observational techniques, as well as emerging new scientific fields such as psychology, replaced physiognomy and phrenology as methods of understanding human nature. As an example of this change, let's take a brief look at one of the most striking parts of the Mütter Museum's collection, the hurdle skulls. The context of the hurdle skulls is that during the 1870s, an Austrian anatomist named Joseph Hurdle examined roughly 139 European skulls to see if there was a connection between the shape of a person's skull and their moral character. Again, that was a foundation of phrenology. However, he ultimately concluded there was no correlation between a person's appearance and who they were on the inside. And the College of Physicians of Philadelphia incidentally acquired Hurdle's collection in 1874, and you can see a wall full of them in the Mütter Museum galleries to this day. This is an image of it. As we mentioned before, one of the biggest problems with physiognomy, as with phrenology, is it's primarily based on assumptions that are virtually impossible to measure between, how do you examine criminality through facial features in people, let alone courage in lions or cunning in foxes and things like that. However, physiognomy, although universally recognized as a pseudoscience today, has had surprising longevity. Writers of Stoker's time encouraged readers to make a connection between the way a person looked and their nature. How else are readers, or viewers in that case, to tell who the good guys and the bad guys are? And fast forward today, and we see a lot of the legacy of physiognomy resonate in popular media. Think of how modern media, especially things like comics, animation, reflect on visual cues that help audiences make quick, unspoken judgments about characters just by looking at them. For example, you see this a lot, for example, in Disney movies. Clear indicators in people's faces of who we should be rooting for. For example, Aladdin. On the left, we have Aladdin characterized by soft, round features, which would have had different meanings in Lavater's time, but are ways of creating an emotional connection with viewers. Broad, expressive eyes, it conveys warmth and energy. Compare that to Jafar, the villain of Aladdin. He's sharp, angular features, in many cases, sneering expressions, the wide eyebrows, the curled beard, and his face giving the appearance of a snake, someone you shouldn't trust. And that this is conveying a nonverbal cue that by looking at these people, you can see their true internal intent, that Aladdin is someone we should root for as a scrappy underdog, and Jafar as someone we should be rooting against. That's, a snake in the grass, and eventually becoming a literal snake near the end of the movie. So going back to our description of courage, quote, signs of courage are coarse hair, an upright carriage of the body, size and strength of bones, sides, and extremities, the belly broad and flat, shoulder blades broad and set well apart, neither too closely nor too loosely knit, a sturdy neck, not very fleshy, a chest well covered with flesh, and broad, flat hips, the thickness of the calf low down the leg, gleaming eyes, neither wide and staring, nor yet mere slits and not glistening, the body of a brilliant hue, a forehead straight and lean, not large and neither quite smooth, nor yet a mass of wrinkles, end quote. And thinking again how cues, for example, what we think of when we think of a hero. Again, going back to the image we saw a while ago of Lavater and seeing how those kinds of characteristics translate into, say, superheroes. Superman, Captain America, say what you will, different characters that conveyed this description. And because I am a 90s kid and a pop culture nerd, I had to at least mention here a shout out to Amalgam Comics, a weird cross project in the early 90s between Marvel and DC, in which they combined Superman and Captain America to make this character Super Soldier. That's for the 90s kids out there. However, with all the fun we're having with this, we should also acknowledge the darker legacy of physiognomy, one that is built on that foundation of a strong relationship with scientific racism and targeting marginalized communities, this idea of the inherent qualities of certain races, ethnic groups, was something that Lavater was talking about, something that people in Stoker's time were talking about, and something that resonates into the present. For example, there have been numerous studies over the last several years examining how healthcare professionals prescribe different pain management solutions to people of different races, in part because of a persistent and incorrect belief that people of color, especially Black women, have inherently higher pain thresholds than other people, that they feel pain differently, going back to sort of inherent characteristics that are again based on biases. In addition, some researchers have also pushed for the benefits of facial recognition software as ways of identifying potential criminals in ways that sound pretty reminiscent of physiognomy. For example, on November 13th, 2016, a pair of Chinese researchers put out a paper asserting they had developed an algorithm that could identify criminality through signifiers of criminal versus non-criminal faces. An abstract from a January 7th, 2020 paper on the same subject asserted, quote, In the same way that a textual post on social media reveals individual characteristics of its author, facial images may manifest some personality traits, end quote. This is saying that's a tribute to Mark Twain, that history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. This author also makes a bold claim that's going to seem funny after all we've talked about so far, asserting, quote, "This work is the first milestone in our attempt to infer personality traits from facial images," end quote. And I feel like our so-called Aristotle might have something to say about that. So why don't we start wrapping up and leaving some time for questions? Johann Caspar Lavater frequently argued that everyone is at some level a physiognomist, that we are all constantly making implicit judgments about people based on how they look. How often do you hear someone has a nice face or kind eyes, or you feel uncomfortable because you just get a bad vibe just by looking at someone? Physiognomy effectively says that's not personal or cultural biases, that's science. And while we no longer believe that intelligence is connected to the size of a person's head, or that we can tell whether someone has laryngitis by the dilations of their nostrils, I challenge you to think about how this silly sounding pseudoscience, built on looking at faces, keeps hanging around, not unlike the immortal Dracula. And with that, why don't we open it up to some questions? Let's take a look at the chat, check out the Q&A, and see what we got.
Hey, Kevin. Hi, everyone. My name is Donna. I'll be reading some of the questions in the chat for you, and then we can move forward with that. We have one coming in. How did scientists deduce these different implications of facial characteristics?
That's a great question. Thank you, Susanna. A lot of that goes back to their inferences that inherent characteristics were connected to animals. And a lot of that being like the way their cultures determined the characteristics of those animals. If you think like Aesop fables and like cunning foxes and determined hares and things like that, or just observing what animals did in the wild. And so going back, that rabbits are timid, they're going to run away from you. And so if we assume that that is what all rabbits will run away, then there must be something in the face that shows that. How they determined what thing it was is a really good question. I don't know if it's, okay, it must be if a person has really long ears, if a person has a rounded like button type nose, that means they're timid. How they come across that is very much culturally determined. And it comes off awful arbitrary sometimes too. Again, I think it's just like, okay, horses seem strong. We can assume all horses are strong. There must be something in the face that says that. It's a lot of that. It's a lot of, we kind of want to connect these 2 points, and it's kind of trying to make a connective thread between the two of them. We have a very human need to weave a web of meaning where there may be none. But thank you for that question.
All right, we have another one right here. This one's kind of funny. I don't know, you might know the answer to this. In regards to the Dracula quote, I've always wondered, what is a fixed mouth? A quick Google search doesn't give an answer, and instead points me to a number of local dentists. I'm assuming Bram Stoker wasn't referring to Dracula having stellar dental work.
That's a great question. But he does talk about his pointy teeth that stick out past his mustache. I think what they're meaning there. So one of the things about physiognomy was, in addition to measuring the actual like measurements of the face, Lavater and other physiognomists were really interested at what a person's face was at rest, a kind of like basic expression that a person has when they're not thinking about it. And like you could say, like facial expressions are how we convey emotions. And so like smiling might indicate you're happy, frowning indicates you're sad, the position of your eyebrows would also, but they believed that there was everyone had a resting face. And that with this case, part of that with Dracula is that this is trying to get an inherent, I think it's also a tight mouth, I think is what he's trying to refer to, like a tightly gripped mouth. He's pursed, I guess, which I guess could convey certain levels of strength and cruelty. And again, he's trying to, a lot of signs point to cruelty. And as the book goes on and Harker spends more time with Dracula, his physiognomic suspicions end up being proven correct.
All right, we have another one right here. This one's pretty interesting. So say if someone's physical appearance changed substantially, such as through an accident or a disease, would the person's character change if it actually did change as a result of trauma? For example, would this kind of support physiognomy's assertions?
That's a great question. This comes up in some of those medical books I mentioned, particularly the Physiognomy of Disease. is a lot of talking about how diseases impact a person's face. Physiognomy is not ideologically consistent. We'll put it that way. And that oftentimes it's, yeah, everyone's got these inherent facial characteristics, but it's also like, if a person has the disease, they're going to exhibit these facial features. Incidentally, a lot of the ones that's put together in that book is feelings of discomfort, which I wonder why. It's often like expressions of concern, expressions of unease. Well, if I'm having a heart attack, I'm pretty darn concerned. But as for things like disfigurement, I do not know how they accounted for those kinds of things. And it's a great question. I hadn't come across, as far as what I've read from Lavater, he doesn't necessarily address that, although I could be wrong. He might have argued that whatever that thing was would then have a reflection on the person's personality. Because again, a lot of what they're arguing in physiognomy is that the body and the soul effectively are inexorably linked. And that, I guess, in the same way that like your cruelty, your kindness, whatever is eventually going to be reflected on your face over time, like think like laugh lines or whatever they thought was the measures that you could tell someone's lying a lot, that it might be if, say, someone suffers a facial injury, maybe that has some kind of impact. And I feel like that some people, as they're developing, psychology and studying the brain, might even have reflections. Like, for example, say someone suffers a traumatic brain injury and then has a dramatic change in their personality. And that way, like Phineas Gage is always the most famous example. He's a railroad worker who tamped down some gunpowder with a metal pole, which caused an explosion, which made the pole go literally through his head, through the top of his skull. And the thing that early neurologists observed was that he had a total personality change, which is unsurprising considering he had a severely traumatic brain injury. And that someone might then look at his physical appearance. There is a photograph that's allegedly of Gage that you might see reflections. There was some scarring. He'd lost an eye in it. And like you might say that shows the personality change he had. So it's kind of hard to measure because, again, the science is not based on any strong foundation. But the other part of it, he might have seen as like, well, if one thing is affecting the other, then the reverse is probably also true. That's the way I would infer it, at least.
So we have another one here. We have, how do you think that this system, even after proven false, gets utilized in the legal system?
That's a really good question. I didn't read too much on legal works that apply physiognomy, so that's really hard to say. I mean, we even see it in terms of popular culture, like when you have courtroom scenes and presenting before a jury. It's like, Your Honor, the defendant clearly has an honest face. And thinking about like the presentation of, like, for example, suspects in the legal system, I think of like this kind of ties into some of my old research, which is I was researching a while ago panics over violent crime and its relationship to video games. And one common thing you often see in crime panics is, to be honest, like lots of pictures of people that news media people want to associate with crime and violence. And inevitably that often meant people of color, particularly young Black and Latino men. And thinking about like criminal profiling is a great way of exampling that. Like, for example, law enforcement people targeting specific areas because there is a belief that those groups of people are connected with criminality. And things of like, say, a police officer randomly picking up a person because they don't like their vibe or whatever. I think you see it a lot in those kinds of things as part of a darker legacy of things like over-policing and particularly stereotyping and profiling specific groups. And you saw with Lavater's time, like some of those images are like the Judas one is an example. Like it seems like very much like an over-the-top like caricature of like a Jewish person kind of thing. And again, tying into prejudice as associating negative connections with certain cultures with particularly, it's always ends up being, marginalized groups who end up being the ones who are specifically targeted for those kinds of things. So that's kind of where I see it from the legal system. Again, as someone who doesn't have a legal background and someone who didn't really do too much research on the criminal justice aspect, aside from the fact that criminologists really thought that, we're going to find the people that are inclined to steal and stuff. Random fun fact, phrenologists thought that the area behind your ear, roughly where an eyeglass would rest, was supposed to be connected with whether or not you were a murderer. That's just a random thing, but a great question. Sorry, I can't give you a better answer.
A few others. I'll read this one, this one question, and then I'll lead into another one because I think they're kind of related. Christina said, has anyone else watched the Indian matchmaking show? The matchmaker often uses a face reader to determine if a couple would match well. Not sure if this is really a common practice, as it is a reality show, but the info the face reader provides from a photo is interesting. And that brings me to this other question someone asked: what are some other examples in pop culture, maybe of physiognomy, influencing how fictional characters are portrayed, either in animation or like casting choices?
That's a really, really good question. As a pop culture geek, I appreciate that question. Animation and cartoons in general are great examples of that. Again, I use the Disney villains one because it's often pretty obvious. And like a lot of this has been changing in more recent years with Disney's animation, but like throughout, I'd say from like the 1930s up and through about the 1990s and 2000s, where you often have these sort of like, again, eyes are often the really big connectors in a lot of animation. The size of the eyes are oftentimes a way of connecting signs of warmness and things like that in cartoons and animation. Whereas like, villains are often like, steering expressions. And again, using Disney as an example, lots of sharp angles are really characteristic of a lot of Disney villains, or intimidating size. The comic book characters very similar to, again, I use that example of Captain America and Superman as indicators of courage. And you often saw that as like indicators of like bad guys. Like one example I always think of, because I'm a DC Comics nerd, is Green Lantern. And Hal Jordan, the Silver Age Green Lantern, who was modeled after Chuck Yeager, was a strong, lantern-jawed guy. And his arch nemesis was his character Sinestro. And Sinestro, aside from the fact that he's not a white dude, his character is red. He's got really pointed, angular features. He's got this tiny little pointed mustache. Like you don't see like tiny little mustaches like that in good guys. And like you think of like the old imagery of like, a mustache twirling villain who's like tying women to like railroad tracks and things like that, versus like your lantern jawed heroes. And like you saw it in comic books, you see it in like, you think of like that old association in Westerns, the people with the white hats versus the people with the black hats. And historically, particularly in American popular culture, has been associating goodness and whiteness. A lot of white characters, like particularly a lot of white men. That's been fortunately changing a lot, and trying to change general perceptions that are associated with, say, villains being like other. And a lot of, I think, where the connections with physiognomy comes is trying to both ground people with certain characters and also distance from others. This is the other. This is the outside. This is what's against our values. This is what's against our reason, kind of thing, and the thing we fight against. And I think it comes through in that way a lot in popular media.
Thank you for speaking on that. So I'll just do maybe one more so we can start wrapping up. But
All right.
Can we talk about just, the lasting legacy of this? How does this translate to today? I know you spoke on it briefly, but.
I mean, it is, again, going back to, Lavater talks about this a lot in essays on physiognomy. It's like we're all physiognomists, he basically says. We're all making assessments of people based on how they look. And again, it's this whole idea of what kinds of judgments you can make. And there's something about, trusting personal instincts and relying on experience. And then there's also like, can you determine whether or not someone's like a temperamental figure by the color of their eyes, But I think the largest legacies I see of physiognomy is in these parts that I mentioned before, which like the one I found really fascinating was coming across those articles on facial recognition software. And the 2016 article, it measured criminality based on mugshots, based on past histories of quote unquote criminals, which is a huge kettle of fish to open up, where it's like, what do we define as a criminal? If a person was arrested, does it mean that they were by definition a criminal? If they were convicted of this crime, and like, we can talk about things that people are wrongfully accused, we can talk about natures of crimes, what are legal versus illegal. But if we're measuring it algorithmically and saying like, here are all the people we have in like a mugshot database, and we're assuming that these are all criminals. For example, if we're putting into those two categories and just random assortions of faces, then like there's a certain level where it's almost like the computers are measuring that like you're, again, going back to the Minority Report reference, it's like, it's out there looking at people and it's like, you're a lawbreaker, you just don't know it yet, kind of thing. And you're going to commit this crime. You're going to steal something. You're going to commit an assault. You're going to murder somebody. And that then gets into really scary territory if you follow that further. So going back to the time of Lavater, like around when Stoker is writing about this, eugenics is popular. If we're taking eugenics by its logical conclusions and connecting with something like physiognomy, if, for example, they're really into things like mental capacity and deficiency, if we see people have overly large heads and we know that's a sign of mental deficiency, what if we start clearing them out of the gene pool, for example? If we see people are inherently criminals, maybe it's easier to lock them up now before they get the chance to commit a murder. And so you could get into some really scary dystopian ways of thinking about that. And if you have people thinking of it, like, what ways do we root out unfavorable elements? That is still around, unfortunately. That's kind of, I think, taking it to its kind of the scariest legacy of physiognomy, is that this idea is still there and where people might try to take it. And again, if we're getting to the position of like, okay, I can tell you just by looking at you, you're a criminal, like that's again, that kind of othering. And like, again, it gets into really, really scary places. On that cheerful note, I'll start wrapping up. Did you have anything else to add, Donna, before I kind of get
No, I think that was, you really summarized that beautifully. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And I've put up a QR code if people want to check out the website for the Year of Dracula, which has a list of all of our past and present events. We got a lot of really, really fun stuff coming up. So again, thank you for having me. Thank you, Donna. Thank you, Rachel Orkowitz, our events coordinator who organized this. And most importantly, thank you, all of you, everyone coming in from as close as the Philadelphia area, as far as Alaska, wherever you came in from. Thank you for your time. Thank you for taking this hour with us. And to close things out, as our former CEO, Dr. George Woolreich, always said, stay socially distant, but spiritually close. Take care, everybody.